Some nights, the dead are quieter than others. I'm Ellis Hartwell, and I've been the night groundskeeper at Riverside Memorial Cemetery for 14 years now. Started when I was 23, fresh out of community college with a landscaping certificate and no real direction. The job posting said maintenance and security, which seemed straightforward enough. Keep the grounds neat, make sure no kids are vandalizing headstones, lock up the maintenance shed before dawn. Simple work for someone who preferred the company of trees to people. Riverside sits on 43 acres of rolling hills about 20 minutes outside town. During the day, it's peaceful in that way. Only old cemeteries can be mature oaks, casting long shadows over weathered granite. The distant hum of highway traffic muffled by distance and greenery. At night, it becomes something else entirely. Not threatening, exactly, but watchful, like the place is holding its breath, waiting for something. My shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I spend most of it driving the maintenance cart along the gravel paths, checking the perimeter fence, making sure the irrigation system is running properly. The newer sections require more attention: fresh sod that needs monitoring, recent burials where the earth is still settling. But I've always been drawn to the older parts of the cemetery, especially Section K, which dates back to 1879. The headstones there are works of art, carved by craftsmen who took pride in their lettering, their angels and willows rendered in stone that's held its detail for more than a century. Section K is where I first noticed her. It was a Tuesday night in early September, about 3 months ago. I was doing my usual rounds when I caught movement on one of the security monitors mounted in my cart. The camera covering Section K showed a figure moving between the headstones, an elderly woman in a long, dark coat, walking slowly but with purpose. She was carrying something white in her hands, flowers maybe. I checked my watch, 3:17 a.m. My first thought was that someone had climbed the fence. It happens sometimes, usually teenagers looking for a thrill or someone wanting to visit a grave after hours. The gates lock at sunset, but people find ways if they're determined enough. I drove over to Section K, taking my flashlight and clipboard. The cemetery rules are clear about after-hours visitors, but I try to handle these situations with compassion. Grief doesn't follow business hours. When I reached Section K, there was no one there. I walked the entire section twice, checking behind the larger monuments and mausoleums. Nothing. The grass was damp with dew, but I couldn't find any footprints or disturbed areas. I radioed back to the office, but Margaret, our night dispatcher, said she hadn't seen anything unusual on the other cameras. I might have written it off as a trick of the shadows, but when I got back to my cart, I rewound the security footage. There she was, clear as anything, an elderly woman with silver hair, maybe 70 or 75, wearing a dark wool coat despite the warm September weather. She was kneeling at one of the graves, placing what looked like fresh daisies at the headstone. The image was grainy, typical of our older security system, but I could see her clearly enough. What made me pause the footage was the grave she was visiting, Plot K47. I knew that plot because it had been a source of confusion during my first year on the job. According to our records, K47 had been designated but never sold, never used. It was just an empty space of grass between two 19th century graves, maintained like the rest of the section, but essentially vacant land. I'd asked Margaret about it once, and she'd pulled the old ledgers. The plot had been reserved in 1923 by someone named Dorothy Millfield, but no burial had ever taken place. I watched the footage again. The woman finished placing the flowers and stood slowly, her movements careful, like someone nursing old joints. Then she turned and looked directly at the camera. Even through the grainy black and white feed, her expression was unmistakable. She was looking right at me, or at least at whoever might be watching. She held that gaze for maybe 5 seconds, then simply walked away, disappearing beyond the camera's range. I drove back to Section K with my flashlight, searching the area around K47. The grass was undisturbed, no flowers, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The following Tuesday, she was back. Same time, 3:17 a.m. exactly, same dark coat, Same slow, purposeful walk to plot K47. Same ritual of kneeling and placing daisies. And again, when she finished, she turned to look directly at the camera. This time I was ready for it, watching the live feed instead of discovering it later. The moment our eyes met through that digital connection, I felt something cold settle in my chest. She knew I was watching. She wanted me to see. I called Margaret over the radio. I need you to check camera 7, section K. Tell me what you see. Just the usual, Ellis. Empty section. Everything quiet. I was looking at the woman on my monitor while Margaret saw nothing. The realization made my hands shake as I held the radio. You sure? No movement at all? Ellis? Honey? You seeing things again? You know how those old cameras can play tricks in the dark? I ended the call without responding. On my monitor, the woman was standing now, still looking at the camera, still looking at me. Over the next few weeks, I tried everything I could think of. I set up my own camera near section K, a trail cam I'd borrowed from my brother who hunts. Tuesday after Tuesday, my camera showed nothing, while the security system recorded the same impossible visit. I started taking screenshots of the footage, printing them out, studying them under a magnifying glass. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The woman was getting younger. It was subtle at first, a slight straightening of her posture, her movements becoming less labored. But as the weeks passed, the changes became undeniable. Her hair grew darker, the lines in her face softened. By late October, she looked like a woman in her 60s instead of her 70s. By November, maybe 55. I pulled the cemetery records for Dorothy Millfield, the woman who had reserved plot K47. It took some digging through boxes stored in the basement of the administration building, but I found her file. Dorothy Millfield had been 28 years old when she reserved the plot in 1923. She'd paid for it in full, along with prepaid perpetual care. The documentation showed she'd been planning her own burial, though there was a note that she'd never specified a funeral home or left instructions for services. There was no record of Dorothy Millfield ever dying. I started staying later on Tuesday nights, positioning myself near section K with binoculars, trying to see her with my own eyes instead of through the camera. But she never appeared to direct observation only to the security system and only to me. Other staff members who reviewed the footage saw nothing unusual. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. Then came the Tuesday night in late November when everything changed. I was at my usual post, watching the monitor as she appeared at 3:17 a.m., but this time she looked different. Younger, still maybe 40 now, her hair a rich brown instead of silver, her coat fitting differently on a frame that had somehow become less frail. She knelt at K47 as always, placing her daisies with reverent care. But when she stood and turned to face the camera, she didn't just look at me, she smiled. It wasn't a comforting smile. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting patiently for something and who finally saw that thing coming to fruition. She raised one hand, not waving, but beckoning. Then she mouthed a single word that I could read clearly, despite the grainy footage. Soon, I found myself standing, my chair rolling backward as I stared at the monitor. The woman continued to smile, continued to beckon, and I felt an overwhelming urge to go to her. To walk out to section K and finally meet this impossible visitor face to face. I took 3 steps toward my cart before the rational part of my mind reasserted itself. Whatever was happening in section K, whatever this woman was or wanted, I knew with absolute certainty that meeting her would be a mistake I wouldn't survive to regret. I spent the rest of that shift locked in the maintenance building, but I could feel her out there, waiting in section K, waiting for me, to stop being afraid, to give in to curiosity, to come close enough to touch. I put in for a transfer the next morning. Margaret approved it without question, said the day shift could use someone with my experience, and that maybe the night work had been getting to me anyway. I've been working days for 3 weeks now, and I sleep better than I have in months. But sometimes, when I'm working near section K in the late afternoon, I catch myself looking toward plot K47. The grass there seems greener than the rest of the section, more vibrant, like something underneath is feeding it, and I swear I can smell daisies, even though it's December and nothing should be blooming. Yesterday, I overheard Margaret talking to the new night groundskeeper, a kid named Ryan who just started. She was telling him about the security cameras, explaining which ones were reliable and which ones occasionally showed glitches. She mentioned camera 7 specifically, said sometimes it picks up movement that isn't really there. I wanted to warn him, to tell him that some glitches are more real than the reality around them, and that some visitors don't need to be alive to be dangerous. But Ryan's young and eager, and he probably wouldn't believe me anyway. Besides, maybe Dorothy Millfield has what she came for now. Maybe she's finished with her weekly visits to the plot she paid for but never used. Or maybe she's just waiting for someone new to notice her. Someone who doesn't know enough to be afraid yet. Some graves don't want to stay buried. I'm David Chen, and I've been the cemetery supervisor at Willowbrook Memorial for 9 years. Before that, I spent 6 years working grounds maintenance, learning every inch of our 120 acres. I know which sections drain poorly after heavy rain, which headstones need regular cleaning to prevent moss buildup, and exactly how much topsoil you need to keep a grave looking neat after the earth settles. Cemetery work requires patience, attention to detail, and respect for the families who trust us with their most precious losses. My daily routine starts at 6 a.m. with a walkthrough of the grounds. I check for any maintenance issues from the night before, review the burial schedule with our funeral directors, and coordinate with our grounds crew. Most of my job involves things people never think about: irrigation systems, drainage, keeping the grass trimmed to the exact height that looks respectful but not overly manicured. We serve families in their darkest moments, so everything has to be perfect. Willowbrook is divided into 12 sections, each with its own character and challenges. The older sections have settling issues where tree roots interfere with graves. The newer areas need constant attention to establish proper drainage. Section B, where our story begins, sits on a slight hill with good natural drainage and mature oak trees. It's one of our most peaceful areas, which is why the problems with Plot 23B have been so unsettling. The trouble started 6 months ago, right after we buried Mrs. Eleanor Vance in late spring. Mrs. Vance was 78, survived by 2 daughters who live out of state. The funeral was small but dignified, maybe 15 people, mostly neighbors and her church friends. Director Martinez handled the service, and everything went smoothly. Mrs. Vance looked peaceful in her rose-colored dress, hands folded with her wedding ring catching the afternoon light filtering through our chapel windows. What struck me as odd was something Director Martinez mentioned after the service. He'd been in the funeral business for 23 years, and he prided himself on attention to detail. But he pulled me aside as we were preparing for the graveside service and said something that stuck with me. "David, did you notice anything unusual when you did the final viewing check?" I hadn't done a final check that was his responsibility as the funeral director. "What do you mean, unusual?" He shook his head, looking genuinely puzzled. "Mrs. Vance looks different somehow. More content than she did during the family viewing yesterday. It's probably nothing, just the lighting in the chapel versus the prep room." I didn't think much of it at the time. Funeral directors see hundreds of bodies every year, and sometimes the stress gets to them. But Martinez was meticulous about his work, not the type to imagine things or get spooked easily. The burial itself went perfectly. Our grounds crew had prepared the gravesite exactly to specification 6 feet deep, walls straight and clean, proper support structures for the vault. We lowered Mrs. Vance's casket with the mechanical precision that families expect, covered everything with fresh sod, and placed the temporary marker. By evening, Plot 23B looked like every other fresh grave in our cemetery. 3 days later, I noticed the first crack. It wasn't dramatic, just a hairline fissure running lengthwise across the grave, maybe 6 inches long. Settling issues aren't uncommon, especially after spring rains, so I had our crew add some topsoil and reseed the area. Standard procedure. A week later, the crack was back, wider this time, and the earth around it had sunk slightly. I checked our burial records to make sure we'd used the proper vault, confirmed that our crew had followed all protocols. Everything looked correct on paper. I had them repair the grave again, using more soil and packing it down more thoroughly. By the end of May, I'd repaired plot 23B 4 times. Each repair held for a few days, sometimes a week, then the earth would crack and sink again. It was as if something underneath was pushing upward, creating pressure that our repairs couldn't contain. I started visiting the grave daily, documenting the problem with photographs and measurements. The pattern was always the same. Cracks would appear overnight, running in roughly the same direction each time. The sinking was gradual but consistent, never dramatic enough to alarm visiting family members during daylight hours, but noticeable to anyone who worked the grounds regularly. Our crew started joking about it. Miguel, who'd been with us longest, called it the stubborn grave and suggested maybe Mrs. Vance didn't like her new accommodations. The others laughed, but I noticed they all avoided working plot 23B alone. When I assigned grave repairs there, they'd always find reasons to work in pairs. By early June, I'd repaired the grave 8 times. The maintenance costs were adding up, and I was running out of reasonable explanations. I called in a soil specialist to test the drainage around plot 23B. His report showed nothing unusual. Soil composition was consistent with the rest of Section B. No excess moisture, no underground streams, or unstable substrata. That's when I started working the problem myself, staying late to handle the repairs personally rather than using our regular crew. The work wasn't difficult. Fill the cracks, add fresh topsoil, level everything out, reseed if necessary. But something about plot 23B felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The first time I heard the sound, I convinced myself it was settling wood, creaking, earth compacting, the normal acoustic effects of a fresh burial. But as the weeks passed and I returned to the grave again and again, I began to recognize that the sound was something else entirely. It sounded like laughter. Not loud or obvious, just a faint, muffled amusement that seemed to come from beneath the ground. At first, I only noticed it during my evening repairs, when the cemetery was quiet and I could hear subtle sounds I'd normally miss. But gradually, the laughter became more distinct, more frequent. I started paying attention to when I heard it. The sound was strongest when I was working alone, usually after 6 p.m. when our regular staff had gone home. It would begin as I started spreading fresh soil, a barely perceptible chuckling that seemed to appreciate my efforts. The more work I did, the more amused whatever was down there seemed to become. By late June, I'd repaired plot 23B 12 times. The laughter had grown clearer, unmistakably human, unmistakably delighted. And I'd started to notice something else that made my hands shake as I worked. The temporary marker kept shifting. Each time I repaired the grave, I'd carefully align the marker with the headstone foundation that would eventually be installed. But when I returned for the next repair, the marker had moved slightly, never dramatically, just a few degrees rotation, as if someone underground was adjusting it for a better view. I pulled Mrs. Vance's burial records again, looking for anything I might have missed. Her pre-need file showed standard arrangements: traditional burial, closed casket service, simple graveside ceremony. But there was a handwritten note in the margin, something Director Martinez had added: "Deceased appears more content than expected. Slight smile noted during final preparation." A smile. Mrs. Vance had been buried with a smile that hadn't been there during the family viewing. I started staying later, sitting in my truck about 50 yards from plot 23B, watching and listening. The laughter usually started around 7 p.m., soft at first, then building to something that sounded genuinely pleased. Sometimes I could hear other sounds shifting, like someone getting comfortable in a confined space. Last week, I made my 14th repair to the grave. As I worked, spreading fresh soil over the familiar cracks, the laughter was clearer than ever. But this time, it wasn't coming just from beneath the ground. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, my hands still holding the rake, and saw nothing. But I could feel a presence, something watching my work with the same amused satisfaction I'd been hearing for months. The evening air felt thick, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint in the soft soil around the gravesmall, feminine prints that began at the edge of plot 23B and led away toward the main path. But they weren't leading away from the grave. They were leading to it, as if someone had walked from the path to where I was working, then simply vanished. I followed the prints back to the path, then noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were more footprints leading from other graves, dozens of them, all converging on plot 23B like spokes on a wheel. All the prints were small, all appeared to be from women's shoes, and all ended at the edge of Mrs. Vance's grave. I finished my repair in the growing darkness, working faster than usual, trying not to listen to the laughter that seemed to surround me now. When I packed up my tools, I could hear voices, not just Mrs. Vance's amusement, but a whole conversation taking place beneath my feet. They were welcoming someone new. I haven't been back to plot 23B since that night. I've assigned the ongoing maintenance to Miguel, told him it's a routine settling issue that needs regular attention. He doesn't ask questions, just adds it to his weekly schedule and files the work orders. But sometimes, when I'm doing my morning walkthrough, I can hear them from Section B, not just Mrs. Vance anymore, but others, a whole gathering of voices, laughing and talking like old friends at a reunion. Yesterday, Miguel mentioned that the grave is staying closed now, that whatever was causing the settling seems to have resolved itself. He seemed pleased, like he'd finally solved a frustrating maintenance problem. I should be relieved. Instead, I find myself wondering what it means when the dead stop trying to dig their way out, and whether Mrs. Vance finally has enough company to keep her entertained. The dead shouldn't dream, but sometimes they forget that rule. I'm Margaret Walsh, and I've been a licensed funeral director at Riverside Memorial Chapel for 18 years. I took over the business from my father in 2007, after spending a decade learning every aspect of the profession under his careful guidance. Funeral work requires a particular temperament. You need to be compassionate, without becoming emotionally overwhelmed, detail-oriented without losing sight of the human element, and comfortable with death in all its forms. Our facility handles about 200 services annually, serving families throughout the Tri-County area. We're a full-service funeral home with our own crematory, preparation rooms, and chapel. Most of my work happens during regular business hours, meeting with families, coordinating with clergy and cemeteries, overseeing arrangements that help people say goodbye to their loved ones with dignity. But funeral directors also work nights. Bodies arrive at all hours, and preparation work often extends well past normal business hours. I've grown accustomed to the quiet solitude of the funeral home. After dark, the soft hum of refrigeration units, the distant whisper of the ventilation system, the particular silence that comes with being surrounded by the recently departed. Our preparation area consists of 3 adjoining rooms: the main embalming room where we perform restorative work, the arrangement room where we dress and position the deceased, and the storage area where we keep our casket inventory. The storage room houses about 40 caskets at any given time, ranging from simple pine boxes to elaborate bronze models with velvet interiors. Each casket is displayed on wheeled platforms, allowing us to move them easily when families want to make selections. I usually conduct inventory twice monthly, checking our stock levels and ensuring everything is properly maintained. It's methodical work that I find oddly soothing, moving through the storage room with my clipboard, noting which models need to be reordered, checking for any damage during shipping or handling. The bronze casket in question, model number 743, manufacturer designation Eternal Rest, arrived 3 weeks ago as part of our regular quarterly shipment. It's a mid-range model with a satin, copper finish, and ivory velvet interior, the type that appeals to families who want something dignified without being ostentatious. We'd ordered 2 of these units, but one had been selected for the Patterson service just days after arrival. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson was 67, a retired elementary school teacher who'd lost her battle with cancer after 18 months of treatment. Her service was particularly moving. The chapel was filled with former students, colleagues, and family members sharing stories about her kindness and dedication. What I remember most clearly was her daughter Sarah singing a lullaby during the eulogy. Golden slumbers. an old Beatles song that Mrs. Patterson used to sing to Sarah as a child. Sarah's voice broke several times during the performance, but she managed to finish the entire song while standing beside her mother's casket. After the service, we used the second bronze casket, the one that remained in our inventory, to show another family our available options. Standard procedure. The Hendersons selected a different model, so the bronze casket was returned to its position in the storage room, where it had sat empty for the past 2 weeks. I first noticed the movement during my evening inventory last Tuesday. It was subtle, just a slight rise and fall of the casket lid, barely perceptible unless you were looking directly at it. My initial assumption was air pressure differential. Our HVAC system sometimes creates slight pressure changes that can affect lighter casket components, though I'd never observed the phenomenon with a bronze model before. I made a note to have our maintenance contractor check the ventilation system and continued with my inventory. But as I moved through the storage room, I found myself glancing back at the bronze casket repeatedly. The movement was rhythmic, consistent, like breathing. Rise and fall, with the steady cadence of deep sleep. I approached the casket for a closer examination. The movement stopped immediately, as if my presence had somehow interrupted whatever was causing it. I checked the lid mechanism, ensuring it was properly latched and secured. Everything appeared normal. I opened the casket to inspect the interior pristine ivory velvet, no signs of damage or disturbance. But when I closed the lid and stepped back, the breathing resumed. I stayed in the storage room for 20 minutes, watching the phenomenon and trying to rationalize what I was seeing. The movement was definitely real. I could see the slight shift in the overhead lighting as the lid rose and fell, could hear the faint whisper of air moving through the seal. But mechanical explanations seemed increasingly inadequate. I checked our security camera system the following morning. We have cameras covering all areas of the funeral home, including the storage room, primarily for insurance purposes. The footage from Tuesday evening showed me conducting inventory, approaching the bronze casket, opening and closing it, but it showed no movement of the lid when I wasn't directly interacting with it. The camera captured me standing motionless for 20 minutes, staring at a stationary casket, while I experienced something entirely different. That evening, I returned to the storage room with a digital recorder, planning to document any sounds associated with the movement. I positioned myself where I could observe the bronze casket clearly and waited. The breathing began around 9:30 p.m., the same gentle rise and fall I'd witnessed the night before. But this time, I heard something elsy, soft humming, coming from within the casket. The melody was hauntingly familiar, though it took me several minutes to place it. Golden Slumbers. The same lullaby Sarah Patterson had sung at her mother's funeral. The same melody that had reduced a chapel full of mourners to tears. But this version was different, softer, more tentative, as if someone learning the song for the first time. I moved closer to the casket, the recorder extended toward the source of the sound. The humming continued, unaffected by my proximity. Up close, I could hear the full melody clearly, note for note identical to Sarah's performance. But the voice was older, more mature, with a warmth that suggested years of practice singing children to sleep. I opened the casket. The humming stopped immediately. The interior was empty, unchanged from my previous inspection. But the velvet lining was slightly warm, as if someone had been resting there moments before. I played back the digital recording that night at home. 23 minutes of ambient room noise ventilation hums, distant traffic, the occasional settling of the building. No humming, no melody, no evidence of the experience that had left me shaking. The pattern continued for the rest of the week. Each evening during inventory, the bronze casket would begin its rhythmic breathing around 9:30. Each time, I would hear the lullaby hummed from within. Each time, the security cameras and audio recordings would capture nothing but my apparent fixation on an empty casket. I began staying later, extending my inventory well past necessary, compelled by a growing certainty that something important was happening in our storage room. The breathing and humming became the focal point of my evenings, a mystery that demanded understanding even as it defied rational explanation. By the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after the first incident, the phenomenon had evolved. The humming was clearer, more confident, as if the singer was becoming comfortable with the melody. But more disturbing was my growing sense that the performance was intended for an audience. Someone was learning the lullaby. Someone was practicing it with the careful attention of a loving parent preparing to comfort a child. That night, I made a decision that still haunts me. Instead of simply observing, I decided to respond. When the humming began, I quietly joined in, adding my voice to the melody emanating from the empty casket. The effect was immediate and profound. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the room was holding its breath. Then, slowly, tentatively, the melody resumed but changed now, harmonizing with my voice in perfect thirds, creating a duet that filled the storage room with impossible beauty. We sang together for perhaps 5 minutes, the mysterious voice and mind blending in a performance of golden slumbers that would have moved Sarah Patterson to tears. The bronze casket continued its gentle breathing throughout, rising and falling in rhythm with our shared melody. When the song ended, I heard something that made my hands tremble as I gripped the recorder. From within the casket came the sound of gentle applause, soft, appreciative clapping that spoke of an audience thoroughly pleased with our performance. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't stop thinking about the implications of what I'd experienced. Who was in our storage room? What did they want? And why had they chosen that particular casket, that specific song? The next morning, I called Sarah Patterson. I told her I was following up on her mother's service, checking to ensure she had all necessary documentation for insurance purposes. But what I really wanted was to hear her talk about the lullaby. "Oh, that song," Sarah said, her voice softening. "Mom sang it to me every night when I was little. Even when I was too old for lullabies, she'd hum it when I was upset or couldn't sleep. I wanted to sing it at the service because I thought maybe she'd hear it and know she could rest now." After ending the call, I sat in my office staring at the bronze casket visible through the storage room doorway. Mrs. Patterson had heard her daughter's lullaby. Somehow, impossibly, she'd learned it, practiced it, perfected it. But why was she sharing it with me? That evening, I entered the storage room with a terrible certainty about what I would find. The bronze casket was breathing as usual, the familiar rise and fall that had become the rhythm of my nights. But this time, when the humming began, it wasn't golden slumbers. It was a song I recognized from my own childhood, Brahms' Lullaby, the melody my mother had sung to me 40 years ago when nightmares kept me awake. The voice was different now, younger, with the particular timbre I remembered from those long-ago nights when maternal comfort was the only thing standing between me and childhood fears. I understood then what was happening in our storage room. Mrs. Patterson wasn't alone in that bronze casket. She was teaching other mothers, other voices, other lullabies meant to comfort children who might need them. Our storage room had become a rehearsal space for the eternal duty of motherhood, the obligation to soothe, to protect, to sing away the darkness. I stopped conducting evening inventory. I reassigned the storage room maintenance to our assistant director, claiming schedule conflicts. But sometimes, when I'm working late in my office, I can hear them through the walls, a chorus of maternal voices practicing lullabies, preparing for children who may never come, maintaining the ancient promise that someone, somewhere, will always be ready to sing away the fears. The bronze casket still breathes. Our security cameras still show nothing. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the building is quiet, I can hear Sarah Patterson's voice joining the chorus, finally learning the lullabies her mother never got to teach her grandchildren. I've stopped questioning what's real. In our business, the line between life and death is more fluid than most people realize. Sometimes love is stronger than logic, and sometimes the dead have work they're not finished with. Mrs. Patterson is still teaching, still singing, still mothering. And I've learned that some mysteries are too beautiful to solve. Memory is the only thing that separates the living from the dead, and sometimes even that line blurs. I'm Carlos Torres, and I've been the night security guard at Oakwood Cemetery for 7 years. It's not glamorous work. Mostly, I drive the perimeter in a golf cart, check that the gates are secure, and make sure no one's causing trouble after hours. The pay is decent, the hours suit my schedule, and I've always found cemeteries peaceful rather than creepy. Dead people don't give you problems the way living ones do. Oakwood covers 68 acres and dates back to 1842. It's divided into 26 sections, each with its own character and maintenance challenges. The older sections have elaborate Victorian monuments and mature trees that create drainage issues. The newer areas are more practical flat markers, geometric layouts designed for efficient mowing. My shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and I've walked every inch of those grounds more times than I can count. Most nights, I follow the same routine. I start with a full perimeter check, then work my way through each section systematically. I carry a flashlight, a two-way radio, and a clipboard for logging anything unusual. The job requires attention to detail, but isn't mentally demanding. I listen to podcasts while I walk, occasionally stopping to pick up litter or note maintenance issues for the day crew. Row 9C sits in the middle section of the cemetery, about halfway between the main entrance and the back fence. It's an older area, established in the 1920s, with a mix of upright headstones and flat markers. The graves there represent typical small-town burials from the mid-20th century local families, long-time residents, people who lived and died when Oakwood was the only cemetery serving our community. I've walked past row 9C thousands of times without paying it special attention. Cemetery sections tend to blend together after a while, especially during night shifts when your flashlight beam only illuminates a few feet in any direction. But 3 weeks ago, something made me stop and actually read the headstones in that particular row. What caught my eye was the uniformity. Every stone in row 9, call 18 of them, bore the same death date, October 13th, 1953. At first, I assumed it was some kind of memorial section, maybe victims of a local disaster I'd never heard about. Small towns have their tragedy-strain wrecks, factory explosions, flu outbreaks that take multiple lives in a short period. It seemed plausible that 18 people might have died on the same date, especially in 1953 when medical care wasn't what it is today. But as I examined the headstones more closely, the scenario became less believable. The deceased ranged in age from 17 to 84. Their surnames were different, no indication of family relationships that might explain a mass casualty event. The stones themselves had been installed at different times, judging by the varying styles and weathering patterns. I made a note to ask the day shift about row 9C, figuring there had to be a historical explanation I wasn't aware of. Cemeteries keep detailed records, and our office manager, Mrs. Kellerman, had worked at Oakwood for over 30 years. If anyone would know about a 1953 disaster, it would be her. The next morning, I stopped by the office before heading home. Mrs. Kellerman was at her desk, reviewing burial permits for the day's services. "Good morning, Carlos. Everything quiet last night?" "Mostly, yes. But I had a question about row 9C. All the headstones there show the same death date, October 13th, 1953. Was there some kind of accident or epidemic that year?" Mrs. Kellerman looked puzzled. "Row 9C. I don't think so. Those burials span several decades, if I remember correctly." "Why do you ask?" "Because every headstone I looked at had the same date, October 13th, 1953. She pulled out a thick ledger and flipped through pages of burial records. "Let's see. Row 9C. Here we are. The earliest burial was 1924. The most recent was 1978. They're spread out over more than 50 years. I insisted on what I'd seen, describing specific headstones and their locations within the row. Mrs. Kellerman listened patiently, then suggested we walk out to row 9C together so she could show me what she was seeing in the records. We made the walk in companionable silence, Mrs. Kellerman moving carefully over the uneven ground in her office shoes. When we reached row 9C, she gestured toward the headstones. "See? Here's Margaret Henley, died 1924. Robert Walsh, 1931. The Peterson stone shows 1946. She moved down the row, reading dates aloud. 1950. 1, 1950, 9, 1960, 3. I stared at the stones she was indicating. Every single one showed October 13th, 1953. The carved numbers were clear, unambiguous, impossible to misread, but Mrs. Kellerman was reading completely different dates from the same headstones. "Carlos, are you feeling all right? You look pale." I managed to nod and thanked her for her time. She returned to the office, leaving me alone in row 9C with the growing certainty that something was seriously wrong with either my vision or my sanity. That evening, I brought a camera. If I was seeing things that weren't there, at least I'd have photographic evidence of my hallucination. If the dates really were all the same, the camera would confirm it. I photographed every headstone in row 9C, taking multiple shots from different angles to ensure clarity. When I reviewed the images on my camera's display, they showed exactly what I'd been seeing October 13th, 1953 on every single stone. But when I printed the photos the next day and brought them to work, they told a different story. The printed images showed the very death dates Mrs. Kellerman had read aloud, the same dates recorded in the burial ledgers, spanning decades of cemetery history. I compared the camera display to the printed photos side by side. The digital images still showed uniform 1953 dates. The physical prints showed the varied chronology everyone else was seeing. I stopped discussing row 9C with my coworkers. The discrepancy between what I was experiencing and what everyone else perceived made me question not just my vision, but my grip on reality. Night shift work can play tricks on your mind. I'd heard other guards talk about seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices in empty buildings. Maybe the isolation was finally getting to me. But I couldn't stop returning to row 9C during my rounds. Each night, I'd walk through that section with my flashlight, reading the same impossible dates, photographing the same unchanging evidence. October 13th, 1953. 18 people, all dead on the same day, according to my eyes and my camera display. I started researching 1953, looking for historical events that might explain what I was seeing. October 13th fell on a Tuesday that year. I searched newspaper archives, historical records, anything that might document a local tragedy. I found nothing, no disasters, no accidents, no unexplained deaths clustering around that date. 2 weeks into my investigation, I made a discovery that changed everything. While reviewing cemetery records in the basement archives, I found a file that had been misfiled decades earlier. It contained correspondence from 1954, including a letter from the State Health Department to the Cemetery Board. The letter was marked confidential and concerned an investigation into irregular burial practices at Oakwood Cemetery. According to the document, state inspectors had found evidence that 18 bodies buried in row 9C had been improperly embalmed, resulting in accelerated decomposition and potential health hazards. The letter recommended immediate exhumation and reburial in a controlled environment, but there was no indication that this recommendation had been followed. The correspondence trail ended abruptly, suggesting the matter had been quietly dropped or resolved through channels not reflected in the cemetery's files. All 18 bodies mentioned in the letter had been buried on October 13th, 1953. I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking as the implications became clear. The dates I was seeing weren't hallucinations or misperceptions. They were memories the cemetery itself, remembering a single day when something went terribly wrong, when 18 burials created a problem that was never properly addressed. That night, I approached row 9C with new understanding. The headstones showed their true dates to the day shift, the dates carved by stonemasons decades apart. But at night, when the cemetery was quiet and the boundary between past and present grew thin, they remembered October 13th, 1953. As I walked through the row, reading the familiar inscription of that recurring date, I noticed something else. The grass over each grave was slightly different at night, more yellowed, as if the soil beneath was somehow compromised. The air had a faint chemical smell that reminded me of formaldehyde. I knelt beside one of the graves and placed my hand on the ground. The earth felt warm, almost fevered, as if something underneath was generating heat. When I pressed my ear to the grass, I could hear a soft bubbling sound, like liquid slowly percolating through soil. The 18 bodies in row 9C were still decomposing. 70 years after burial, they were continuing a process that should have ended decades ago. And every night, the cemetery remembered the day they were all buried together, the day when someone made a mistake that created an ongoing problem no one wanted to acknowledge. I stopped taking photographs. I stopped discussing the discrepancy with coworkers. Instead, I began to accept that some truths are only visible to certain people at certain times. Row 9C shows different faces today and night, revealing its secret only to those who walk its paths when the living world is asleep. Mrs. Kellerman retired last month, replaced by a younger woman who doesn't have 30 years of institutional memory. The burial records remain unchanged, showing decades of varied death dates. But the headstones continue their nightly transformation, reverting to October 13, 1953, whenever darkness falls. I've requested a transfer to day shift, citing family obligations that require schedule changes. The paperwork is being processed, and I should be switching to normal hours within the month. Because I've realized something about row 9C that troubles me more than the impossible dates or the ongoing decomposition. Each night, the section seems a little larger. Not dramatically just 1 or 2 additional graves that weren't there before, graves with fresh soil and temporary markers indicating recent burials. All dated October 13th, 1953. The cemetery is still remembering that day, still adding to the collection, still trying to finish whatever process began 70 years ago, when 18 people were buried improperly on the same Tuesday afternoon. I don't want to be there when it finally remembers enough. Sometimes the dead travel roads that don't exist, to places they were never meant to go. I'm James Morgan, and I've been driving for Eternal Care Transport Services for 11 years. We handle body transfers between funeral homes, hospitals, and cemeteries across 3 counties. Not glamorous work, but steady and well-paying. The job requires a commercial driver's license, attention to paperwork, and the ability to treat every transport with dignity and professionalism. I've moved over 4,000 bodies in my career, and each one deserves the same respect I'd want for my own family. Eternal Care operates 6 vehicles from our dispatch center on Route 9. We run 24 hours, 7 days a week, serving funeral homes that don't have their own transport capabilities. Most of our calls are routine hospital to funeral home to crematory, occasional transfers between facilities when families change arrangements. I prefer night shifts because traffic is lighter and families aren't around to see the transport process, which can be emotionally difficult for them. My route that Tuesday covered the eastern part of our service area, including Riverside Memorial Funeral Home and Hillcrest Cemetery. Both facilities are longtime clients with professional staff who understand our procedures. I'd worked with them dozens of times over the years, so when dispatch called with a transfer order, I expected another routine pickup. The paperwork came through around 10:30 p.m. A standard transfer form requesting body transport from Riverside Memorial to Hillcrest Cemetery for an early morning burial. The deceased was listed as Eleanor Hartwell, age 73, with all appropriate authorization signatures and permit numbers. Everything looked correct. Funeral home, letterhead, proper state forms, director's signature. The GPS coordinates for both locations were included, though I knew both facilities well enough to drive there without assistance. I loaded my equipment and drove to Riverside Memorial, arriving at approximately 11:15 p.m. The funeral home sits on a quiet residential street, a converted Victorian mansion with a modern addition housing their preparation facilities. Night pickups are common, so they have procedures for after-hours access and staff available for transfers. I backed up to their service entrance and rang the bell. After a few minutes, the night manager appeared, a thin man I'd worked with before, though I couldn't recall his name. He seemed confused when I presented the transfer paperwork. Eleanor Hartwell? I don't have any record of that name. Are you sure you have the right facility? I showed him the paperwork again, pointing to the Riverside Memorial letterhead and address. Everything matched their facility information exactly. But he insisted they had no one by that name in their care. No pending transfers scheduled for that evening. "Look," he said, checking his tablet, "we have 3 bodies here tonight. Wilson, Peterson, and Caldwell. No Hartwell, no transfer orders to Hillcrest. Maybe there's been a mix-up with another funeral home." I called dispatch from the parking lot. Sarah, our night operator, confirmed the order Eleanor Hartwell, Riverside Memorial to Hillcrest Cemetery, all paperwork properly submitted. She read me the reference numbers, the authorization codes, even the director's signature line. But when I went back inside with this information, the night manager remained adamant that no such person was in their facility. We spent 20 minutes going through their computer records, checking every database, reviewing all recent intakes. Nothing. Eleanor Hartwell had never been at Riverside Memorial Funeral Home. Yet I held official paperwork with their letterhead, requesting her transfer to Hillcrest Cemetery. "I should have called Sarah back," reported the discrepancy, and returned to base. Standard protocol for paperwork problems is to contact the client directly and resolve any confusion during business hours. But something about the situation bothered me, not just the missing body, but the night manager's reaction. He seemed genuinely puzzled, rather than simply uninformed. Instead of heading back to dispatch, I decided to drive to Hillcrest Cemetery. Maybe there had been a communication error, and Eleanor Hartwell was already there, waiting for morning burial services. It wasn't unusual for bodies to arrive ahead of schedule, especially if family members were traveling from out of state. The drive to Hillcrest takes about 25 minutes on back roads through rural countryside. I'd made the trip hundreds of times, mostly during daylight hours for morning burial services. At night, the route feels different, darker, more isolated, with long stretches between streetlights where your headlights become the only illumination. My GPS showed the familiar route, taking me through downtown, past the old industrial district, then onto County Road 12 toward the cemetery. But something felt wrong about the drive that night. The road seemed longer than usual, the turns more frequent. I found myself checking the GPS repeatedly, wondering if I'd taken a wrong turn despite following the suggested route exactly. Hillcrest Cemetery sits on 43 acres of rolling hills, about 5 miles outside town. The main entrance has electronic gates that close at sunset, but cemetery staff provide access codes for after-hours burials and emergency situations. I'd used the code before, so entry wasn't a problem. I parked near the administrative building and called the cemetery's emergency number. The answering service connected me to Jim Kowalski, the night caretaker who handles after-hours issues. He was at the cemetery within 15 minutes, driving up in his pickup truck with the familiar grumbling demeanor of someone awakened from sleep. "Morgan, what brings you out here this late? We don't have any scheduled deliveries tonight." I explained about Eleanor Hartwell, showed him the transfer paperwork. Like the Riverside manager, he seemed genuinely confused. He checked his tablet, confirmed that no burials were scheduled for the next morning, no advance deliveries expected. "Eleanor Hartwell. That name doesn't ring any bells. You sure this isn't meant for Oakwood Cemetery? They handle a lot of the Eastern County burials." But the paperwork clearly specified Hillcrest Cemetery, included their correct address and contact information. Jim and I spent another 20 minutes reviewing cemetery records, checking for any recent plot purchases or burial arrangements. Nothing matched Eleanor Hartwell or the reference numbers on my transport order. I left Hillcrest around 1:30 a.m., completely baffled by the evening's events. 2 professional facilities, both with computerized record systems, both claiming no knowledge of a deceased person whose transfer I'd been officially authorized to handle. The paperwork in my possession appeared legitimate proper forms, signatures, official letterheads, but corresponded to a body that apparently didn't exist. I called dispatch one more time before heading back to base. Sarah confirmed again that the order had come through their normal channels, properly submitted and authenticated. But when I described my experience at both facilities, she sounded as confused as everyone else I'd spoken with that night. "James, are you feeling all right? You sound tired. Maybe you should head back to base, and we'll sort this out in the morning with a fresh perspective." I agreed, partly because I was tired, but mostly because I couldn't think of anything else to do. The transfer order made no sense, but I'd followed proper procedures and done everything possible to locate Eleanor Hartwell. Sometimes paperwork gets mixed up, especially between multiple facilities handling dozens of bodies simultaneously. But as I drove back to base, something else began bothering me. I couldn't remember loading Eleanor Hartwell into my vehicle, but according to my GPS, I'd driven the complete route from Riverside Memorial to Hillcrest Cemetery. The navigation system showed the entire trip, logged the exact mileage, even recorded the timestamps for departure and arrival. According to the electronic record, I'd picked up Eleanor Hartwell at 11:30 p.m. and delivered her to Hillcrest Cemetery at 12:15 a.m. But I had no memory of loading a body, no recollection of the actual transport, no mental image of the person I'd supposedly moved between facilities. I pulled over at a rest stop and checked my equipment. The gurney showed signs of recent use of straps, slightly loose, surface cleaned but still damp from disinfectant. My transport bag contained fresh body sheets and tie-down materials, things I would have used during a routine pickup. Everything suggested I'd completed a standard transfer, exactly as indicated by the GPS and paperwork. But I couldn't remember any of it. The more I tried to recall the evening's events, the more fragmented my memory became. I remembered driving to Riverside Memorial, talking with the night manager, driving to Hillcrest Cemetery, speaking with Jim Kowalski. But between those conversations was a gap of 45 minutes of missing time, during which, according to electronic records, I'd completed a body transfer that apparently never happened. I sat in that rest stop parking lot for nearly an hour, trying to piece together what I'd experienced. 2 facilities with no record of Eleanor Hartwell, official paperwork requesting her transfer, GPS data showing I'd completed the transport route, equipment indicating recent use, and a complete absence of memory regarding the actual body I'd supposedly moved. When I finally returned to base, I found Sarah completing her shift reports. I handed her the transfer paperwork and briefly described the evening's confusion. She filed everything normally, noting that the client discrepancy would be resolved during business hours. "These things happen sometimes," she said. "Miscommunication between facilities, paperwork errors, computer glitches, don't worry about it." But I did worry about it. I worried about the 45 minutes I couldn't remember. I worried about the GPS data that showed a route I'd driven but couldn't recall. Most of all, I worried about Eleanor Hartwell, a woman who might have needed transport between facilities, whose family might be expecting her burial, but who seemed to exist only on a single piece of paperwork that no one could verify. I requested the next few days off, citing family obligations that required my attention. Sarah approved the time without question, probably assuming I needed rest after the confusing night shift. But I spent those days driving the route between Riverside Memorial and Hillcrest Cemetery, trying to reconstruct what had happened during those missing 45 minutes. The drive was exactly as I remembered, 25 minutes through familiar countryside, past landmarks I'd seen hundreds of times. Except for one thing I hadn't noticed before. About halfway between the 2 facilities, there's a side road I'd never paid attention to, County Road 12A, barely marked, leading into what looks like undeveloped woodland. During my reconstruction drives, I found myself slowing at that intersection, feeling an inexplicable urge to turn down the side road and see where it led. I never did turn. Something about that particular road felt wrong, dangerous in ways I couldn't articulate. But each time I passed the intersection, my GPS would flicker briefly, showing a route that wasn't there moments before, then reverting to normal navigation. I returned to work the following week, accepting new assignments without mentioning my concerns about the Eleanor Hartwell transfer. The paperwork had been filed, the incident noted as a client communication error, the matter officially resolved. But sometimes, during night shifts, dispatch will call with transfer orders that seem routine until I arrive at the pickup location. Funeral homes with no record of the deceased. Cemeteries with no scheduled burials. GPS routes that lead to facilities that insist they never requested transport services. And always, always, those 45 minutes of missing time when I apparently complete transfers I can't remember, moving bodies that don't exist, serving families who are never there when I arrive. I've stopped questioning these assignments. I follow the paperwork, drive the routes, complete the forms. But I know now that some transfers happen on roads that exist only at night, serving destinations that appear only when the living world isn't watching. Eleanor Hartwell got where she needed to go that Tuesday night. I just can't remember taking her there. Flowers don't lie, even when everyone else does. I'm Kay Richardson, and I've been working grounds maintenance at Cedar Hill Cemetery for 8 years. It's honest work-keeping, the grass trimmed, the walkways clear, and the memorial gardens looking respectful for visiting families. I take pride in making sure every section of our 57 acres looks properly maintained. People come here during the worst times of their lives, and they deserve to find their loved ones resting in a place that shows care and dignity. Cedar Hill serves 3 small towns in our rural county, with burial records dating back to 1868. We handle about 120 burials annually, plus ongoing maintenance for over 4,000 existing graves. My daily routine involves mowing designated sections, weeding around headstones, and clearing away flowers that have wilted or been damaged by weather. It's seasonal work that changes with the calendar-heavy grass cutting in summer, leaf removal in fall, snow clearing in winter, and spring cleanup that reveals what winter left behind. The flower maintenance is one of my favorite responsibilities. Families leave fresh arrangements regularly, and part of my job involves removing them once they've deteriorated beyond respectful appearance. I try to be sensitive about timing fresh. Flowers get a week or 2. Silk arrangements can stay longer if they're weatherproof. The goal is maintaining dignity without creating clutter or attracting pests. I've developed an eye for flower quality over the years. You learn to distinguish between roses that will last several days and arrangements that need immediate removal. Fresh white roses, properly cut and watered, should maintain their color for 4 to 6 days in moderate weather. They'll wilt gradually, petals dropping naturally, but the basic color should remain consistent until the final stages of deterioration. That's why I first noticed the anomaly 3 months ago in Section C. Mrs. Linda Hartwell had been buried on a Tuesday following a well-attended service. She was 62, survived by 2 adult children who seemed genuinely devoted to their mother's memory. The day after burial, someone left a beautiful arrangement of white roses on her gravia. Dozen long-stemmed flowers in a clear glass vase, obviously expensive and carefully arranged. I checked the flowers Wednesday morning during my routine maintenance. They looked perfect, crisp white petals, strong stems, properly hydrated. No reason to remove them for at least a week. Thursday morning, the roses were completely black. Not wilted, not brown around the edges, not showing normal signs of deterioration. Every petal had turned deep black overnight, as if they'd been dipped in ink. The stems remained green and healthy looking, but the flower heads were uniformly dark, creating a stark contrast against the clear glass vase. I assumed someone had played a prank or vandalized the arrangement, maybe sprayed them with paint or some kind of chemical. Cemetery vandalism isn't common in our area, but it happens occasionally. I removed the blackened roses and made a note to check the security camera footage, though our system only covers the main entrance and parking areas. 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time, the grave was in Section A. Robert Chen, 45, buried after what I'd heard was a sudden death. Same pattern, beautiful white roses left by grieving family members, perfect condition when I checked them in the afternoon, completely blackened by the following morning. I started paying closer attention to flower arrangements after that, especially white roses. Over the next month, I documented 4 more incidents. Always white roses, always the same overnight transformation from pristine white to uniform black. Different sections of the cemetery, different families, different florists judging by the arrangement styles. But they all had something in common that took me weeks to recognize. I began researching the deceased whose graves were affected by the blackened roses. It required careful attention to local obituaries, funeral home records, and sometimes conversations with long-term cemetery staff who remembered details about particular burials. What I discovered made me wish I'd never started investigating. Mrs. Linda Hartwell hadn't died from natural causes, despite what her obituary implied. I learned from a friend who worked at the hospital that there had been questions about her medication levels, concerns raised by nursing staff about potential overdose. The investigation was quietly dropped when her children declined an autopsy, citing religious objections. Robert Chen's sudden death had also raised questions. He'd been healthy, no known medical issues, but collapsed at work one afternoon and died before paramedics arrived. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, though Chen was young and physically fit. His wife inherited a substantial life insurance policy and moved to Florida within 6 months of the burial. Each grave where white roses turned black belonged to someone who had died under circumstances that weren't quite what they seemed. Not necessarily murders, I wasn't thinking in terms of crime drama scenarios, but deaths where the official explanations felt incomplete, where families had reasons to avoid further investigation, where questions existed that no one wanted to pursue. I started keeping a list in a notebook I carried during my rounds, not just the names and dates, but details I could gather about each case. The pattern became clearer as weeks passed. 7 graves now showed the blackened rose phenomenon, and all 7 involved deaths that had generated quiet speculation in our small community. Margaret Foster, 78, supposedly died from complications of diabetes, but neighbors mentioned she'd been afraid of her nephew, who inherited her house and moved in immediately after the funeral. David Walsh, 53, died in a hunting accident. His hunting partner inherited a jointly owned business that had been struggling financially. Jennifer Patterson, 29, overdosed on prescription medication. Her husband remarried within a year to a woman he'd been seen with before Jennifer's death. The roses were serving as some kind of indicator, reacting to graves where the truth had been buried along with the deceased. But I couldn't understand the mechanism, what was causing fresh flowers to change color overnight, and why only at these specific sites. I decided to test my theory directly. Last month, I purchased white roses from the same florist used by several affected families. I placed identical arrangements on 3 graves, one from my list of suspicious deaths, one recent burial where I knew the circumstances were straightforward, and one older grave where the person had died peacefully of natural causes decades earlier. The next morning, only the roses on the suspicious grave had turned black. I repeated the experiment with different flowers, white carnations, white lilies, even white plastic arrangements that couldn't possibly be affected by natural processes. The results were consistent. Only fresh white roses turned black, and only on graves where the deceased had died under questionable circumstances. I considered reporting my observations to the police, but what would I tell them? That flowers were changing color in ways that suggested certain deaths weren't what they seemed? That I'd developed a theory about cemetery roses that could serve as some kind of posthumous investigation tool? Instead, I began researching the history of Cedar Hill Cemetery itself, wondering if there was something about the soil or groundwater that might explain the phenomenon. What I found in the historical records changed my understanding of everything I'd been observing. Cedar Hill was built on land that had been the site of a 19th century family cemetery, a small private burial ground that served the area's founding families. When the land was purchased for expansion into a public cemetery in 1937, the original graves were supposed to be relocated to a section of the new cemetery set aside for historical burials. But according to records I found in the County Historical Society, several of the original bodies were never moved. The relocation had been hasty, conducted with minimal oversight, and some graves had been accidentally overlooked or intentionally ignored. The new cemetery was built directly over burial sites that still contained the original occupants. The blackened roses were appearing on graves directly above these older burial sites. I mapped the locations where I'd observed the phenomenon and compared them to the historical records. Every affected grave sat on or very close to the original family cemetery plots. The older bodies, buried over a century ago, were lying beneath the more recent burials. I found records for most of the original burial's 19th century families who'd lived hard lives in rural conditions when medical care was limited and death investigations were rare. But scattered through the burial records were notes that suggested some of the original deaths had been suspicious even by the standards of their time. Martha Brennan, age 34, buried 1883. Death by misadventure. Circumstances questioned by family. Thomas Kelly, age 41, buried 1879. Sudden death following dispute with business partner. Sarah Mitchell, age 26, buried 1891. Died unexpectedly. Husband remarried within the month. The pattern extended back over a century. The original burial ground had been home to people who died under circumstances that raised questions their families couldn't or wouldn't pursue. When Cedar Hill Cemetery was built on top of these graves, something about those unresolved deaths began affecting the new burials placed above them. The White Roses weren't just reacting to recent suspicious deaths. They were responding to the presence of older victims buried beneath, people who'd been murdered or died under questionable circumstances and never received justice. When similar deaths occurred in the graves above them, some kind of recognition took place. The flowers served as a bridge between past and present injustices, marking locations where truth had been buried twice. Last week, I made a discovery that convinced me to document everything I'd learned. While researching property records for the original family cemetery, I found a surveyor's report from the 1937 relocation project. The document included a hand-drawn map showing which graves had been successfully moved and which had been left behind. According to this map, there are 17 original burial sites still beneath Cedar Hill Cemetery. I've only identified 7 graves where white roses turned black overnight. That means there are 10 more locations where suspicious deaths from over a century ago are still waiting to connect with similar injustices. 10 more places where the flowers will serve as witnesses when the right circumstances align. I've been watching the remaining sites carefully, noting when fresh white roses are placed on graves that sit above the original burial locations. Most stay white, indicating that the recent deaths were legitimate. But I know that eventually, someone will be buried above one of those older graves, someone who died under circumstances that mirror the injustices from a century before. When that happens, the flowers will know. They'll turn black overnight, creating a connection between victims separated by decades but united by the truth that was never allowed to surface. I've started visiting the cemetery at night sometimes, walking through the sections where I know the original graves are located. The ground feels different above those sites, not visibly different, but somehow charged with the presence of the long dead who never received justice. And sometimes, when I'm standing above one of those unmarked graves in the darkness, I can hear something that sounds like whispers coming from beneath my feet. Not words I can understand, but voices that seem to be sharing information, comparing stories, preparing for the next time white roses will serve as their testimony. The flowers that know are waiting patiently for their next chance to speak. Sometimes the dead listen more carefully than the living ever do. I'm Robert Price, and I've been the mausoleum caretaker at Riverside Memorial Gardens for 12 years. The job involves maintaining our indoor burial facility buildings, housing over 300 individual vaults, plus the administrative work that comes with serving families who choose above-ground interment. It's specialized work that requires attention to detail, sensitivity to grieving families, and comfort with spending long hours in spaces where the recently deceased rest behind marble and bronze facades. Most people don't realize how much maintenance mausoleums require. Climate control systems need constant monitoring to prevent moisture damage. Individual vault seals must be inspected regularly to ensure they remain airtight. The marble surfaces need cleaning and polishing to maintain their dignified appearance. Beyond the technical aspects, I coordinate with funeral directors, manage the scheduling for interment ceremonies, and serve as the primary contact for families visiting their loved ones. My daily routine starts at 7 a.m. with a complete walkthrough of both buildings, checking environmental systems and noting any maintenance issues. During business hours, I'm available to assist visiting families and coordinate with funeral directors, bringing bodies for interment. The evening shift involves security checks, final climate adjustments, and paperwork review. I usually finish around 6 p.m., but sometimes stay later during busy periods or when families need after-hours access for special circumstances. The newest building houses vaults 1 through 150, with modern amenities and updated systems. The older building contains vaults 151 through 300, built in 1968, with the solid construction techniques of that era. Each vault is individually sealed and climate-controlled, designed to provide permanent protection for caskets and urns placed within them. Vault 127 is located in the older building, third row from the bottom, middle section of the west wall. It houses the remains of Harold Brennan, a retired postal worker who died 3 years ago at age 74. Mr. Brennan had been a quiet, methodical man, according to his family, never married, devoted to his work, lived alone in the same house for 40 years. His niece arranged for the mausoleum interment because he'd specifically requested above-ground burial in his will. I remember Mr. Brennan's interment ceremony because it was unusually brief. Just his niece, her husband, and a few neighbors who'd known him for decades. The funeral director commented afterward that Mr. Brennan had been a man of few words in life, someone who preferred listening to talking, observing rather than participating in conversations. That detail became significant 3 weeks ago when I first heard the echo. I was conducting my evening security check, walking through the older building, and ensuring all systems were functioning properly. The mausoleum is naturally quiet at night-thick walls, sealed vaults, and sound-absorbing materials create an atmosphere of profound silence that most people find either peaceful or unsettling. As I passed Vault 127, I heard a voice coming from inside. Not muffled or distant, but clear and distinct, as if someone was speaking in a normal conversational tone just on the other side of the marble facing. The voice was familiar, though it took me a moment to recognize it as my own. I know this is difficult, Mrs. Patterson, but we'll make sure everything is handled with dignity. It was a conversation I'd had earlier that day with a woman whose husband was being interred in the newer building. I'd used those exact words when she'd broken down crying during the final arrangements. But now I was hearing my own voice speaking those same words from inside Harold Brennan's vault, a space that had been sealed for 3 years. I stood outside Vault 127 for several minutes, listening to the impossible playback of my afternoon conversation. The voice was definitely mine, same inflection, same pacing, even the slight hoarseness I get when I've been talking extensively with families during emotional situations. The conversation continued exactly as I remembered it, including Mrs. Patterson's responses, though her voice sounded different, somehow fainter, like it was being filtered through some kind of acoustic barrier. The entire exchange lasted about 5 minutes, ending when I'd originally walked Mrs. Patterson to her car. After that, silence returned to the vault. I reported the incident the next morning, describing it as possible acoustic interference from the building's sound system. Our facility uses speakers for background music during services, and I suggested there might be a wiring issue causing sound to carry into the vault areas. The maintenance contractor checked the electrical systems but found no problems. The echo happened again 2 nights later. This time it was a different conversation from earlier, that DIA discussion I'd had with a funeral director about scheduling conflicts for the following week. Again, my voice was perfectly clear, emanating from inside Vault 127, repeating the conversation word for word with exact timing and inflection. I began documenting the phenomenon, noting when it occurred and which conversations were being repeated. The pattern was consistent. Every second or third night, I'd hear my own voice coming from Harold Brennan's vault, replaying conversations I'd had during that day's work. The conversations weren't random selections. They were always interactions that had involved emotional content discussions with grieving families, sensitive arrangements with funeral directors, moments when people had shared personal details about their deceased loved ones, routine administrative conversations, simple scheduling discussions, or casual interactions with coworkers were never repeated. It was as if something inside Vault 127 was carefully selecting and preserving only the conversations that carried emotional weight. After 2 weeks of documentation, I decided to test the phenomenon more systematically. I began having brief conversations with myself during my evening rounds, speaking aloud about various topics while standing near different vaults. If there was some kind of acoustic anomaly in the building, it should affect other locations besides Vault 127. The test results were definitive. Only conversations I'd had with other people were ever repeated, and only from inside Harold Brennan's vault. My experimental self-conversations, conducted near various other vaults, were never echoed back. That's when I remembered something Harold Brennan's niece had mentioned during his interment arrangements. She described her uncle as someone who'd spent his entire life listening to other people's stories, not just as a postal worker delivering mail and occasionally chatting with residents on his route, but as someone who genuinely cared about the lives and struggles of people in his community. Uncle Harold never talked much about himself, she'd said, but he remembered everything you told him. He'd ask about your kids, your job troubles, your health problems. He cared about people, even if he wasn't good at expressing it. Harold Brennan had been a professional listener, someone who'd spent decades absorbing the concerns and emotions of others without sharing much of his own life in return. Now, 3 years after death, something of that listening quality remained active inside his sealed vault. The phenomenon became more frequent as weeks passed. Almost every night now, I'd hear my own voice coming from Vault 127, repeating conversations from that day or previous days. The selected conversations became increasingly personal moments when families had shared intimate details about their loved ones, discussions about financial struggles related to funeral costs, admissions of guilt or regret from people dealing with complicated grief. I found myself becoming more careful about what I said during the day, knowing that emotionally significant conversations would be preserved and repeated from inside Harold Brennan's vault. The knowledge made my interactions with grieving families feel different, more observed, as if every sensitive moment was being archived by an invisible witness. Last week, the echo changed in a way that made me question everything I thought I understood about the phenomenon. I was having a difficult conversation with the Martinez family, whose mother was being interred after a long battle with cancer. During our discussion, Mrs. Martinez broke down while describing how guilty she felt about not visiting her mother more frequently during the final months of illness. I offered the usual comfort, assuring her that her mother had understood and forgiven any perceived shortcomings. That night, I heard the conversation repeated from Vault 127 as usual, but this time, when I reached the part where Mrs. Martinez had expressed guilt about not visiting her mother enough, I heard something that hadn't been part of our original conversation. My voice, speaking words I'd never said. "She knows you loved her, Maria. She's not holding anything against you. She just wants you to forgive yourself." Mrs. Martinez's first name was Maria, but she'd never mentioned it during our conversation. I'd addressed her formally as Mrs. Martinez throughout our discussion. Yet somehow, my voice from inside the vault was using her first name, speaking words of comfort that went beyond anything I'd actually said. Harold Brennan wasn't just replaying conversations. He was improving them, adding the emotional support and personal connection that I'd perhaps wanted to provide but hadn't quite managed during the actual interaction. The realization disturbed me more than the original echo phenomenon. The idea that something inside that vault was not only listening to my conversations but editing them, making them more emotionally effective, suggested a level of awareness and intention that went far beyond simple acoustic repetition. I mentioned my concerns to my wife last Thursday, telling her about the strange occurrences at work and admitting that I was considering looking for a different job. The constant feeling of being observed and recorded was affecting my ability to work naturally with grieving families. That night, the echo from Vault 127 included a conversation I'd never had with anyone at work. My voice speaking to my wife in our kitchen. "I'm thinking about quitting, Helen. This job is starting to get to me in ways I can't explain. Sometimes I feel like the dead are listening to everything I say. judging how well I'm helping their families cope. Helen's voice, responding exactly as she had. You've always been good at this work, Robert. Maybe you just need a vacation, some time away from the mausoleum. Then my voice again, but saying something I hadn't said. I can't leave them, Helen. They depend on me to hear what the families are really saying, to understand what they need even when they can't express it. Someone has to listen properly. Harold Brennan was including my private conversations now, conversations that had taken place in my own home, far from the mausoleum. But more than that, he was editing my responses to reflect thoughts I'd had but never voiced the sense of responsibility I felt toward both the living families and the deceased who'd been entrusted to my care. I haven't mentioned the phenomenon to my wife since then. I haven't discussed quitting my job again, either at home or at work. Because I've come to understand that Harold Brennan isn't just listening to conversations that happen within the mausoleum walls. He's listening to everything, everywhere, collecting the emotional content of interactions that relate to death, grief, and the care of the deceased. And he's preserving them inside Vault 127, creating an archive of human compassion and loss that grows larger every day. Sometimes now, late at night when the echo begins, I'll hear conversations I know I've never had, discussions with families I've never met, words of comfort spoken in my voice to people I've never encountered. Harold Brennan is generating new conversations, using my voice to provide the emotional support he wishes he could have offered during his own lifetime. I understand now why he chose my voice for this impossible archive. Not because of anything special about me, but because I'm the caretaker, the person responsible for maintaining the dignity of the dead and the comfort of the living. Harold Brennan spent his life listening to others without sharing much of himself. Now he's using my voice to finally speak all the words of comfort and understanding he collected but never had the chance to offer. I won't be quitting my job. Someone needs to be here to provide the voice Harold Brennan never had, to speak the words of compassion he's been saving for 70 years. The dead listen more carefully than the living, and sometimes they have important things to say in return. The dead don't make appointments, but they're usually considerate enough to leave paperwork. I'm Anna Novak, and I've been the records keeper at Willow Grove Cemetery for 16 years. My job involves maintaining detailed documentation of every burial, exhumation, and memorial service conducted on our 93 acres since the cemetery opened in 1852. I manage both digital databases and physical archives, coordinate with funeral directors for scheduling, and serve as the institutional memory for families seeking information about loved ones buried here decades or even centuries ago. Record keeping and cemetery management requires obsessive attention to detail. Every burial must be documented with precise location coordinates, depth measurements, vault specifications, and family contact information. I maintain cross-reference files by name, date, section, and plot number. The system allows me to locate any grave within minutes and provide families with complete burial histories dating back over a century and a half. My office occupies the basement level of our administration building, surrounded by filing cabinets, archived ledgers, and computer terminals, displaying cemetery management software. I spend most days updating burial records, responding to genealogy requests, and coordinating with funeral homes for upcoming services. The work suits my temperament: methodical, quiet, and focused on preserving the detailed history of our community's deceased. Willow Grove is divided into 12 sections, with the oldest areas dating to the cemetery's founding. Section A contains our most historical burials, including Civil War veterans and founding families, whose elaborate Victorian monuments reflect the craftsmanship of earlier eras. The newer sections feature more practical layouts, designed for efficient maintenance and contemporary funeral practices. Section A has been essentially full since the early 20th century. According to my records, the last burial there occurred on March 15, 1987. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, aged 91, interred in the family plot her husband had purchased in 1963. Since then, all burials have been directed to newer sections with available space and modern utilities. That's why I was confused 3 weeks ago when I noticed fresh graves during my quarterly inspection of Section A. I conduct physical inspections of all cemetery sections 4 times annually, comparing ground conditions to my burial records and noting any maintenance issues for our grounds crew. It's detailed work that requires walking every row, checking headstone conditions, and ensuring that our physical cemetery matches the documented records. During my February inspection of Section A, I discovered 4 graves that shouldn't have existed. They were located in the northeast corner of the section, an area that had been empty grassland according to my records. But these weren't obviously new graves. They looked like established burial sites that had been there for years. The grass had settled naturally around slightly sunken rectangles of earth. Each grave was marked with weathered headstones, showing appropriate aging for monuments that had weathered decades of seasons. I checked my records immediately. According to every database and archive document I maintain, no burials had been authorized or conducted in that area of Section A since Mrs. Chen in 1987. The plots in question had never been sold, never been designated for burial, never appeared in any funeral director's arrangements. Yet there they were, 4 graves with headstones bearing names I didn't recognize. William Hayes, died 2018. Martha Sullivan, died 2019. Robert Kim, died 2020. Sarah Mitchell, died 2021. The dates were recent, but the headstones looked decades old. The carved letters showed the kind of weathering that develops over long exposure to rain, snow, and temperature changes. The granite surfaces had the subtle color variations that come from years of seasonal expansion and contraction. I photographed the graves for documentation, planning to research the names in our regional death records and determine how these burials had been conducted without proper cemetery authorization. But when I reviewed the photos later in my office, they showed only empty grassland, where I'd clearly seen the 4 graves. I returned to Section A the following day with my assistant, Jennifer, who helps with data entry and family communications. I wanted a witness to confirm what I was seeing and help solve what seemed to be an administrative mystery. "See those 4 graves in the northeast corner?" I asked as we walked toward the area. Jennifer looked where I was pointing. "Which graves?" "That's all empty space over there." I stared at the burial sites that were clearly visible to me: settled earth, weathered headstones, the unmistakable appearance of established grave sites. But Jennifer saw nothing except the level grass that should have been there according to my records. "The headstones are right there," I insisted, walking directly to William Hayes's grave. "The stone says he died in 2018. Jennifer followed me, looking concerned. "Anna, there's nothing here, just grass. Are you feeling all right?" I placed my hand on William Hayes's headstone, feeling the cool granite surface and the carved letters spelling out his name. But Jennifer continued to see empty ground, showing no awareness of the grave marker I was clearly touching. I sent Jennifer back to the office and spent the rest of the afternoon documenting the graves with detailed measurements and rubbings of the carved inscriptions. The headstones provided complete information: full names, birth and death dates, even some with brief epitaphs. All 4 people had died within the past 5 years, but I had no record of their burials at Willow Grove. That evening, I researched the names in online obituary databases and death records. William Hayes, Martha Sullivan, Robert Kim, and Sarah Mitchell had all been real people who died on the dates carved into their headstones. But according to public records, they'd been buried at different cemeteries throughout our state. None had any connection to Willow Grove or our local community. Yet somehow, their graves were appearing in our oldest section, complete with weathered monuments that looked like they'd been there for decades. I began visiting Section A daily, monitoring the mysterious graves and documenting any changes. The graves remained visible to me, but invisible to everyone else: grounds, crew, funeral directors, visiting families, and my own assistant. I could photograph the headstones clearly with my phone's camera, but when I transferred the images to my computer or printed them, they showed only empty grass. The phenomenon seemed to affect only traditional cameras and digital displays. My direct vision showed the graves clearly, but any attempt to create permanent documentation failed. After 2 weeks of daily observation, I noticed something that made my documentation efforts feel more urgent. The graves were aging in reverse. Instead of the weathered appearance I'd initially observed, the headstones were gradually becoming cleaner, sharper, less affected by the elements. The settled earth around each grave was rising slightly, as if the soil was expanding from below. The overall appearance was shifting from established burial sites to increasingly fresh graves. I realized the mysterious graves weren't static installations. They were changing over time, moving backward through the normal aging process that affects all burial sites. They'd appeared to me as decades-old graves, but they were progressively becoming newer, as if I was watching their burial process in reverse. On Monday morning, exactly 3 weeks after I'd first noticed the graves, I arrived at Section A to find them looking like fresh burials completed the day before. The headstones appeared newly carved. The earth was mounded slightly above ground level, and even the grass around the edges looked recently disturbed. But according to my records, no burials had been scheduled for Section A. No funeral directors had requested plots in that area. No families had purchased burial rights in the oldest section of our cemetery. I was witnessing burials that had never officially happened, graves that existed only in my perception, headstones marking the deaths of people who'd been buried elsewhere. The mysterious graves were somehow pulling deceased individuals from other cemeteries, creating unauthorized burials that defied both documentation and shared reality. That afternoon, I made a decision that still haunts me. I brought a shovel to Section A and began carefully excavating one of the graves William Hayes, who'd been the first to appear and whose burial site looked the most recently established. I dug carefully, treating the excavation as if it were an authorized exhumation requiring proper protocols. At approximately 3 feet depth, my shovel struck something solid. I cleared the soil away and found the top of a concrete burial vault, exactly the type used in contemporary cemetery burials. Inside the vault was a casket containing the remains of a man who matched William Hayes's description from his obituary. His driver's license, found in his suit pocket, confirmed his identity. According to the death certificate folded in his jacket, he'd been buried at Meadowbrook Cemetery, over 200 miles away, following a service attended by his family and friends. Yet here he was, interred in an unauthorized grave at Willow Grove Cemetery, in a section that had been closed to new burials for over 30 years. I carefully reburied William Hayes and restored the grave to its previous appearance. But the experience left me with questions I couldn't answer and documentation I couldn't share. How do you report unauthorized burials that only you can see? How do you explain finding remains that officially exist in completely different cemeteries? I've stopped trying to photograph the graves. I've stopped discussing them with other staff members. Instead, I've begun maintaining a separate set of Records unofficial documentation of the burials that don't officially exist. The graves continue to appear in Section A, always in the same pattern. Elderly appearance, gradually aging in reverse until they look like fresh burials, at which point they seem to stabilize. I now document 12 unauthorized graves, all containing people who died within the past 5 years and who were officially buried at other cemeteries. I don't understand why I can see them when no one else can, or why these particular deceased individuals are creating secondary burial sites at Willow Grove. But I've accepted my role as their unofficial record keeper, maintaining documentation for graves that exist outside normal cemetery administration. Sometimes I wonder if there are other unauthorized burials throughout our cemetery graves, visible only to certain people under specific circumstances. Deceased individuals who found ways to create multiple resting places, despite official records indicating single burials elsewhere. The dead don't make appointments, but they seem perfectly capable of making their own arrangements when the formal system fails to serve their needs. And someone has to keep track of where they actually end up, even if those records can never be officially maintained. After all, everyone deserves to be properly documented, whether their burial was scheduled or not. Some people need mourning so badly they'll accept it from strangers, even dead ones. I'm Michael Reed, and I've worked night security at Restwood Memorial Cemetery for 5 years. It's solitary work that suits my temperament, monitoring camera feeds, walking periodic perimeter checks, and ensuring our 47 acres remain undisturbed during overnight hours. The job requires attention to detail without demanding constant interaction with people, which works well for someone who prefers observation to conversation. My shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., based out of a small security office near the main entrance. The office contains 6 monitors, displaying feeds from cameras positioned throughout the cemetery, along with basic communication equipment and emergency protocols. Most nights are entirely routine: the occasional deer wandering through older sections, cats hunting near the maintenance buildings, and the predictable patterns of weather affecting outdoor surveillance equipment. Restwood opened in 1943 and now contains over 3,000 burials arranged in 12 clearly defined sections. The older areas feature traditional upright headstones and family plots purchased by established local families. Newer sections accommodate contemporary preferences for flat markers and more efficient land use. Each section has distinct characteristics that become familiar through nightly observation: the mature oak trees in Section D, the memorial garden in Section F, the veterans area with uniform military markers. My responsibilities include monitoring for vandalism, unauthorized visitors, and maintenance issues that require immediate attention. I document any unusual activity in a daily log and coordinate with local law enforcement when necessary. The work involves long periods of routine observation, interrupted by brief moments requiring quick decision-making. Cemetery security cameras serve multiple purposes beyond basic surveillance. They help locate family members who become lost during evening visits, document maintenance problems that develop overnight, and provide evidence in the rare cases of theft or vandalism. The camera system covers main pathways, entrance points, and most burial sections, though some older areas have limited coverage due to mature trees and irregular topography. I first noticed the night mourner 6 weeks ago during what seemed like a routine evening shift. Camera 4, which monitors Section B, showed a tall figure moving slowly between headstones around midnight. The person appeared to be an elderly man, wearing a long, dark coat, walking with the careful steps of someone navigating uneven ground in low light. He was carrying something small in his hands, possibly flowers. After hours, visitors aren't uncommon, especially around anniversaries or holidays, when families feel compelled to visit graves outside normal cemetery hours. Most are grieving relatives who need privacy for their emotional processes. I usually monitor such visits without interference, unless someone appears to be damaging property or behaving erratically. The man in the dark coat moved purposefully toward a specific grave in the northeast corner of Section B. He knelt beside the headstone and remained motionless for several minutes. From the camera angle, it looked like he was speaking, though I couldn't determine if he was praying aloud or having a one-sided conversation with the deceased. After approximately 10 minutes, he stood, placed whatever he'd been carrying near the headstone, and walked away toward the older sections of the cemetery. Camera coverage in those areas is limited, so I lost sight of him as he moved beyond the range of our surveillance system. I made a note in the daily log about the late-night visitor and continued with routine monitoring. The incident seemed unremarkable: a family member or friend paying respects outside normal visiting hours. The following night, he returned. This time, Camera 5 captured him in Section C, kneeling at a different grave with the same ritual behavior. 10 minutes of motionless attention to the headstone, apparently speaking to the deceased, then departure toward the poorly monitored older sections. By the end of that week, I documented the night mourner, visiting 7 different graves across 4 sections of the cemetery. He appeared every night between midnight and 12:30 a.m., always spending exactly 10 minutes at each location before disappearing into the areas where our camera coverage couldn't follow. I began tracking his visits systematically, noting the specific graves he chose and trying to identify patterns in his behavior. The locations seemed random: different sections, different time periods of burial, different types of memorial markers. But his ritual was consistent: approach slowly, kneel beside the headstone, remain motionless while apparently speaking, then leave after exactly 10 minutes. After 2 weeks of documentation, I decided to research the graves he was visiting. I used our cemetery record system to identify the deceased individuals whose graves attracted the night mourner's attention. What I discovered changed my understanding of what I was witnessing. Every grave he visited belonged to someone who had died alone with no listed next of kin. Margaret Torres, Section B, died at 70, 3 in the county hospital with no family present. Buried with funds from her estate after a brief service attended only by a hospital chaplain and 2 nurses. Robert Kim, Section C, found deceased in his apartment after neighbors complained about mail accumulation. No family members could be located for burial arrangements. Dorothy Walsh, Section D, homeless woman who died of exposure during a winter storm. Local churches raised funds for her burial, but no relatives were ever identified. The pattern continued through every grave the night mourner had visited. Solitary deaths, unclaimed bodies, burials arranged by county services or charitable organizations. People who had died without anyone to mourn their passing or visit their final resting places. I expanded my research to include all similar burials at Restwood over the past decade. Our cemetery contained 43 graves of people who had died alone with no identified family or friends. The night mourner had visited 21 of them so far, following what appeared to be chronological order based on burial dates. The realization that someone was systematically visiting the graves of forgotten deceased individuals should have been comforting. Instead, it disturbed me in ways I couldn't articulate. There was something unsettling about the precision of his ritual, the exact timing of each visit, and his apparent knowledge of which graves belonged to people who had died in isolation. I tried to photograph the night mourner during his visits, but the camera system's night vision capabilities produced images too grainy for clear identification. I could see his general outline and movements, but couldn't distinguish facial features or other identifying characteristics that might help determine who he was or how he'd acquired information about the cemetery's most isolated burials. 3 weeks into my observations, I noticed something that made my documentation efforts feel increasingly urgent. The night mourner wasn't leaving flowers or traditional memorial items at the graves. Instead, he was leaving small stone-a-single pieces of granite or marble that blended with the cemetery's existing landscape. The stones were placed carefully beside each headstone, positioned as if they held significance beyond simple decoration. I began checking the graves during my morning perimeter walks before ending each shift. Every location the night mourner had visited now contained a small stone that hadn't been there previously. The stones were all similar in size and shape, approximately 3 inches long and smoothly rounded, as if they'd been shaped by water or careful handling over long periods. During my 4th week of observation, I made a discovery that changed everything I thought I understood about the night mourner's activities. While researching burial records for people who had died alone, I found a death certificate that stopped me cold. The night mourner himself, the tall man in the dark coat who had been visiting graves every night for a month, had died 3 years ago. Thomas Bennett, aged 74, had been found deceased in his apartment after missing several appointments at the Veterans Clinic, where he received treatment for chronic health conditions. He had no living relatives and no close friends. His body had been unclaimed for 2 weeks before county services arranged for burial at Restwood Memorial Cemetery. Section A, Plot 47. Thomas Bennett had been buried in the same area where my camera coverage was limited, where the night mourner disappeared after each visit. I checked the burial records again, searching for any errors in dates or identity information. But the documentation was clear. Thomas Bennett had died alone and been buried at Restwood with no mourners present at his graveside service. Now he was visiting the graves of others who had shared his fate, people who had died in isolation and been buried without anyone to remember their lives or mark their passing with regular visits. That night, I watched the monitors with new understanding. When the night mourner appeared on camera 5 at exactly midnight, I was seeing a dead man continuing the work of compassion he perhaps wished someone had done for him. He knelt beside the grave of William Chen, a retired factory worker who had died alone in 2021. For 10 minutes, Thomas Bennett spoke to the headstone, providing the words of remembrance that no living person had offered. Then he placed another small stone beside the memorial marker and walked back toward his own grave. I followed his route on multiple cameras as far as coverage allowed, watching him disappear into Section A, where his own unmarked grave waited. County burials often lack the elaborate headstones purchased by grieving families. Thomas Bennett was buried in a plot marked only by a small concrete marker with his name, and dates the minimal memorial provided for people who die without resources or relatives to arrange more substantial monuments. The following morning, I walked to Thomas Bennett's grave for the first time since learning his identity. The concrete marker was weathered and barely visible among the grass. No flowers, no decorations, no signs that anyone had visited since his burial 3 years earlier. But surrounding his marker were dozens of small stones, carefully arranged in concentric circles that extended outward from his grave like ripples on water. The stones were identical to the ones he left at other burial sites, smooth, rounded pieces of granite and marble that created a memorial garden visible only to someone standing directly above his resting place. Thomas Bennett was collecting stones during his nightly visits, gathering memorial tokens that other mourners had left throughout the cemetery and bringing them back to his own grave. He was creating the memorial display that no living person had provided, using stones borrowed from the graves of people who had been loved and remembered by families who visited regularly. But he was also leaving stones at the graves of people who had died alone, ensuring that every forgotten burial site received at least one memorial token, one small indication that someone had acknowledged the life that ended there. I realized then that the night mourner wasn't just visiting the graves of people who had died alone. He was serving as their mourner, providing the ritual remembrance that every deceased person deserves, but that no living relative or friend had been available to offer. Thomas Bennett had died alone, but he had chosen not to remain alone. He was building a community of the forgotten deceased, connecting isolated burials through his nightly visits and creating relationships between people who had shared the experience of dying without witnesses. I stopped documenting his visits in the official security log. Instead, I began maintaining a private record of his route and timing, ensuring that I never interrupted his work or called attention to activities that seemed to provide comfort to both Thomas Bennett and the people he visited. Some nights now, I'll walk the perimeter during his visits, staying far enough away to avoid interference but close enough to serve as a witness to his compassionate work. The cemetery feels different knowing that someone is taking responsibility for the forgotten dead, ensuring that no burial goes entirely unmourned. Thomas Bennett died alone, but he's no longer lonely. Every night, he visits friends who understand what it means to be forgotten by the living, and every morning, his own grave displays the memorial stones that mark his growing community of the remembered dead. The living world abandoned Thomas Bennett, but the dead have welcomed him as their designated mourner. And sometimes, being forgotten by the living is just the beginning of finding your true purpose among those who understand what solitude really means. Time doesn't always move forward at the same speed for everyone, especially when you're alone with the dead. I'm Frank Durant, and I've been the night supervisor at Greenwood Memorial Park for 13 years. My responsibilities include overseeing security, coordinating with funeral directors for after-hours services, and maintaining detailed incident reports for anything unusual that occurs during overnight hours. The work requires someone comfortable with solitude and capable of handling the administrative duties that keep a cemetery functioning smoothly around the clock. Greenwood operates as both a traditional cemetery and memorial park, serving families throughout our metropolitan area with burial services, cremation options, and grief counseling programs. We handle approximately 400 burials annually across our 112 acres, including special services that extend well past normal business hours. Night supervision ensures that late arrivals, emergency situations, and security issues are managed professionally regardless of timing. My shift begins at 10 p.m. and continues until 6 a.m., based out of the administrative building near the main entrance. The office contains communication equipment, security monitoring systems, and filing cabinets filled with burial records, maintenance schedules, and emergency protocols. Most of my duties involve routine documentation, periodic grounds checks, and serving as the primary contact for funeral directors who need after-hours access to cemetery facilities. The incident reporting system requires detailed documentation of any events that occurred during night shifts maintenance issues, security concerns, unusual weather conditions, or interactions with visitors who arrive outside normal operating hours. I complete these reports using standardized forms that include timestamp entries, detailed descriptions, and my signature authenticating the information. The reports serve as official records for insurance purposes and help day staff understand any issues that developed overnight. For 13 years, I've maintained meticulous incident reports that reflect the typically quiet nature of cemetery night shifts. Occasional equipment malfunctions, rare instances of after-hours visitors, and routine security checks comprise most entries. My handwriting is distinctive, precise block letters developed during military service and easily recognizable to anyone familiar with my documentation style. That's why I was puzzled 6 weeks ago when I found incident reports completed in my handwriting that documented events I couldn't remember. The first anomaly appeared on a Tuesday morning when I was preparing to end my shift. I always review the night's incident reports before leaving, ensuring all documentation is complete and properly filed. But that morning, I discovered an entry I hadn't made. The report was filled out in my distinctive handwriting, time-stamped at 3:17 a.m., describing a conversation with a family visiting Plot 247 in Section C. According to the documentation, I'd spoken with an elderly woman and her adult son who'd arrived to place flowers on a recent burial. The report noted that I'd provided them with directions to the gravesite and helped carry their memorial arrangements. I had no memory of this interaction. Section C had been part of my routine security check around 3 a.m., but I'd encountered no visitors during the walkthrough. Plot 247 contained a recent burial, Mrs. Helen Martinez, interred 3 days earlier following a well-attended funeral service. But I was certain no family members had visited that location during my shift. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, down to the specific way I formed the letter R and my habit of drawing a line under important details. The report included accurate information about cemetery layout, proper protocol language, and details about the Martinez burial that only someone with access to our records would know. Yet I had no recollection of writing it or experiencing the events it documented. I considered the possibility that I'd forgotten a routine interaction due to fatigue or distraction. Night shift work can affect memory, and minor conversations sometimes blur together over time. But the level of detail in the report suggested a significant interaction that should have been memorable, not a brief encounter I might forget. The following week, I found another mysterious report. This one described maintenance work I'd supposedly performed in the older section of the cemetery, adjusting irrigation timers, clearing debris from drainage systems, and documenting equipment serial numbers for the monthly inventory report. The timestamp showed 2:45 a.m., and the handwriting was again unmistakably mine. But I'd performed no maintenance work that night. My shift had been entirely routine standard security checks, administrative paperwork, and brief radio contact with our answering service. I'd never left the administrative building except for normal perimeter walks that didn't include the maintenance areas described in the report. I began paying closer attention to my incident reports, checking them immediately after completion each morning and comparing my conscious recollections with the documented activities. Over the next month, I found discrepancies approximately twice weekly reports filled out in my handwriting describing events I couldn't remember. The phantom reports always followed the same pattern. They documented activities that occurred between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m., involved interactions with visitors or maintenance work in cemetery areas I hadn't visited that night, and included accurate details that suggested genuine familiarity with Greenwood's operations. Each report was signed with my name and concluded with the same phrase, "All quiet until the shift change." The phrase bothered me because I'd never used those exact words in any incident report. My standard closing was, no further incidents to report, or shift completed without issues. But the mysterious reports consistently ended with reference to a shift change that didn't correspond to any actual staffing transition. I started staying more alert during the 2:30 to 3:30 a.m. period, paying particular attention to my activities and surroundings during the times when the phantom reports indicated I was supposedly interacting with visitors or performing maintenance work. But during those periods, I remained at my desk completing routine paperwork, with no gaps in my conscious memory. 3 weeks ago, I decided to set up a small recording device in my office, positioning it to capture both my desk area and the door to document my actual activities during the mysterious incident reporting period. If I was having episodes of memory loss or sleepwalking, the recording would provide objective evidence of what was actually occurring. The next morning, I reviewed the recording from the previous night. The footage showed me working normally at my desk from 10 p.m. until approximately 2:45 a.m., at which point the recording stopped. The timestamp jumped from 2:45 a.m. to 3:35 a.m., showing a 50-minute gap in what should have been continuous surveillance. But my incident report for that night, filled out in my handwriting, documented a detailed conversation with a funeral director who'd arrived to coordinate arrangements for an early morning burial. The report included specific details about the deceased, burial plot assignments, and logistical coordination that would have required extensive interaction and access to cemetery records. I had no memory of this conversation, and the recording device showed no evidence that anyone had entered or left my office during the 50-minute gap. I replaced the recording device with a different model, checking the battery levels and memory capacity to ensure technical reliability. The same thing happened normal recording until approximately 2:45 a.m., then a gap until 3:35 a.m., during which time I supposedly completed incident reports describing activities I couldn't remember. The pattern was becoming more disturbing as I paid closer attention to the content of the phantom reports. They described interactions with visitors who had legitimate reasons to be at specific grave sites, maintenance work that actually needed to be performed, and administrative tasks that were genuinely part of my responsibilities. But they documented a version of my job that I wasn't consciously experiencing. Last Tuesday night, I made a decision that still unsettles me when I consider its implications. Instead of trying to monitor or record the mysterious incident reporting period, I decided to embrace it. I left a blank incident report on my desk with a pen, along with a note asking my other self to explain what was happening during the missing time. Wednesday morning, I found the incident report completed in my handwriting. It documented routine security checks, coordination with a late-arriving funeral director, and assistance provided to a family visiting their recently deceased father. The report concluded with the standard phrase, "All quiet until the shift change," but written in the margin, in handwriting that was unmistakably mine but somehow more hurried, was a response to my note, "Frank, we're both doing the same job. You handle the day-to-day operations, and I take care of the night shift duties you're not equipped to handle. The families need someone available during their hardest hours, even when visiting hours are officially closed." The marginal note continued, "You see the cemetery as a business operation. I see it as a place where people come to process their grief without the constraints of schedules and public behavior expectations. We're both necessary, but we work in different versions of time." I stared at the note for an hour, trying to understand its implications. My other self was suggesting that there were two versions of my night shift, the routine administrative work I consciously performed, and a parallel version where I served families who needed after-hours access to their deceased loved ones. But the most disturbing aspect was the signature at the bottom of the marginal note. It wasn't my normal signature or even my usual initials. It was signed FD Night Shift with a timestamp reading 3 a.m. shift change. There was no 3 a.m. shift change at Greenwood Memorial Park. I worked alone from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. with no overlap or transition between different supervisors. Yet my other self consistently referenced this non-existent shift change as if it were a normal part of cemetery operations. I've stopped trying to monitor or control the phantom incident reports. Instead, I've begun to appreciate that my night shift role might be more complex than I originally understood. If there's a version of me that provides essential services to grieving families during off hours, perhaps that's not something I need to interfere with. The incident reports continue to appear, documenting interactions and maintenance work that I don't consciously remember but that seem to serve legitimate cemetery functions. Families who visit during unconventional hours, funeral directors who need after-hours coordination, and maintenance issues that require immediate attention, all handled by the version of me that operates during the missing 50 minutes each night. I've started leaving supplies and information that might be useful for these phantom duty sextra incident report forms, updated contact lists for funeral directors, and maintenance schedules that might help my other self serve families more effectively. Yesterday morning, I found a note in the margin of my incident report. "Thank you for understanding, Frank. The work we do after 3 a.m. helps people who can't wait until normal business hours to process their grief. Time moves differently when you're mourning, and sometimes the dead need advocates who operate outside conventional schedules. I don't understand how I can be working two different versions of the same job, or why my conscious memory only includes one version of my nightly duties. But I've accepted that Greenwood Memorial Park operates on multiple levels of time, and that some families need services that exist outside normal administrative hours. The dead don't follow business schedules, and apparently, neither do the people who serve them. My job continues until dawn, but now I know that someone else, with my face and my handwriting, takes over when the conventional workday ends and the real grief work begins. All quiet until the shift change.